St Magnus Cathedral was built as a site of pilgrimage to house the shrine of a saint. Hundreds of years ago, it looked very, very different to the way that it does today. There would have been colour on the walls, plastered and painted. There would have been rich tapestries hanging from the pillars. There would have been clergy round about dressed in beautiful vestments. And at the heart of it all, the shrine of St Magnus, beautifully decorated. Throughout the year, services and offices were held, but the biggest day of the ecclesiastical year was the 16th of April, and that was St Magnus Day. For 24 hours, songs would have been sung, prayers would have been said, and outside, the townspeople would have enjoyed a day of holiday and rest. There would have been dancing, there would have been feasting, there would have been music. Everybody would have been paying their respects to the glory of the cathedral and to their St Magnus. But the second most important day of the year was the 13th of December. And that was St Lucy's Day, significant to Magnus because that was the day he was translated, the day in which his bones, his relics were enshrined in the cathedral. 13th of December, St Lucy's Day, is still an important part in Orkney's calendar. It forms the centrepiece of our great Christmas and tree lighting traditions. And Lucy, or Lucia of the Light, is celebrated all over Northern Europe. She herself was an Italian saint, but she is much loved in the Northern Hemisphere because she brings the light back into the darkness. So the 13th of December in the old calendar was actually depths of winter, the very heart of the darkest, gloomiest time of year. So what better excuse than to fill the place with light and colour and greenery to celebrate Magnus's second feast day. As time went on and fashions changed and theology changed, the way that the cathedral looks also changed. During the Reformation, all the rich colour and the decoration was stripped away, back to this beautiful stone that we see today. But every now and again, the cathedral reveals just a tiny glimpse of its medieval past. Not that long ago, 30 years ago, two men came in to the cathedral late one night. Now, they had every right to be there. One of them was the bell ringer and one of them was the custodian, and they had been old friends for many, many years. They let themselves in at the side door at the front of the cathedral, and as they looked up, expecting to see their beautiful cathedral, a vision presented itself before their eyes, because the cathedral looked different. Between the pillars, there are great swags of greenery. Colours like jewels glowed from the walls. Thousands of candles lit the space with a golden glow, as if it was decked out in its beautiful Christmas medieval finery. The two men stood in wonder and in awe for a moment or two, and then the vision faded, disappeared back into the walls, and it became the beautiful cathedral that we know it today. But just for that tiny little moment, little crack in time allowed them to see what St Magnus Cathedral would have been like in its medieval glory. Standing now in the choir of St Magnus Cathedral. This is possibly the most spiritually charged part of the whole building, because it's here on this site that the relics, the bones of St Magnus, were brought and enshrined. This magnificent cathedral was built as a site of pilgrimage to house the shrine of a saint, and it encouraged pilgrims from all over Northern Europe to come to this spot and venerate the relics of St Magnus. St Magnus was the Earl of Orkney in the 12th century. He shared the power with his cousin Haakon, and between the two of them they ruled the islands. But they had very different characters, and they fell out. There was power plays on both sides, and a very different ruling style from the cousins. And eventually they realised that they had to come to some agreement as to how Orkney was to be governed. They took themselves off to the island of Egglesea, and they had an agreement that they would both take an equal number of ships, an equal number of men, and that the men would be unarmed. There was to be no conflict at this meeting. Unfortunately, Magnus was betrayed. This led to his death at the hands not of his cousin Haakon, but on his orders. You see, Haakon himself refused to kill Magnus, wouldn't actually strike the blow. So he asked one of his followers to do it, a man called Leifolf, and he was the cook. He'd been brought along to cook the great feast after the conference, and he was given the order that he had to kill Magnus. Magnus met his death with grace. He knelt before Leifolf and he said, "I'm going to pray to God that he forgives you for what you are about to do. I have a favour to ask. Please, when you strike the blow, not the back of my neck like a common thief. I want to face my death head on, strike the blow to the front of my head." And so Leifolf took the axe that he'd been given and he brought it squarely down on the top of Magnus's head. And that was the death of Magnus. He was originally buried in Bursey, and almost immediately strange things began to happen. Lights were seen floating over the gravesite. Heavenly fragrances could be detected coming from the earth, and people started claiming miracles. They had been cured of this sickness or that madness, and a cult grew up around Magnus, and people said this man was a holy man. He was a saint. As time went on, these stories were heard by a little boy growing up in Norway. His name was Ronald, and he went on to become the Earl of Orkney himself. He was Magnus's nephew, and he swore that if the people of Orkney supported him, that he would build them a magnificent stone minster in honour of his uncle Magnus, and that he did. In the 1150s, the cathedral was consecrated and the relics of Magnus were brought here and enshrined in a magnificent shrine. It would have been richly decorated, gold, precious jewels, enamels, and the pilgrims came from all over Northern Europe. The cathedral was extended as more and more pilgrims wanted to come and venerate the relics. But in 1560, everything changed. Scotland went through a reformation. It became a Protestant country. The shrine was dismantled. The relics of St Magnus disappeared, and it was assumed that they had been destroyed. And then, in 1919, whilst the building was under restoration, a workman working on this pillar here, this stone wall, discovered a loose stone. When it was prized from the wall, they realised that there was a cavity, there was a hole in the wall that went right the way back into the structure, and deep, deep buried inside it, there was an object. When they brought it out, they discovered it was a wooden box. And when they opened it, inside there was a set of bones. The skull had a huge hole cleft in the top of it, exactly as if it had been hit by an axe. Could these be the relics of St Magnus? Well, they were taken to Aberdeen University in the 1920s and they were examined at great length. Professor Reid of Aberdeen University, a professor of anatomy, declared that these must be the bones of St Magnus himself. In 1925, the bones were put back in the wall, and that's where they remain to this day. We assume that during the 1560s, the clerics of the cathedral were told to destroy the bones, but they didn't. They decided instead to hide them in the most important, the most spiritually charged, the holiest part of the cathedral, feet away from when his original shrine would have been. So we are the only church in Scotland to have the bones of their original saint. We are very fortunate that St Magnus still resides within this pillar and keeps watch over us all. Below doth lie, if ye would try, come read upon this broad, the corpse of Robert Nicholson, whose soul's above with God. He, being 70 years of age, ended this mortal life. 50 of those he was married to Jean Davidson, his wife. Betwixt them two, 12 children had, whereof 5 are left behind. The other 7 is with him in heaven, whose joy shall never end. And there you have it, a man's life, written on a beautiful piece of wooden board and displayed in St Magnus Cathedral. What we have here is a mort brod. And Robert Nicholson was a man who lived in Kirkwall in the early 17th century. He was a glassmaker. And when he died, he was privileged to be buried inside the walls of this ancient building. But it would have taken a while for the great stone monuments to be carved in his honour. And so as a temporary measure, this wooden sign was painted. And they were quite common at that time in the early 17th century throughout Scotland. And they would quite often have the details of people's lives, any armorial crests on them perhaps. And usually when the big stone memorial was completed, the wooden ones would be taken down. But sometimes they would be incorporated into the fabric of the building itself, displayed on the walls hung from the pillars, for example. At the end of the 1600s, the church in Scotland sent out a directive, an instruction to every church to say, if you have one of these wooden boards, a mort brod, get rid of them, destroy them, burn them. They are not required. This one seems to have escaped the cull, and it is actually the oldest mort brod known to exist in Scotland. Now, on the front of it, as you can see here, we have a wonderful depiction of a skeleton, and he's dressed in a shroud and his little bony feet poking out from beneath it. This, of course, is the figure of death, and he has a big grin on his face because he knows that we're all going to be gathered in to his embrace eventually. But he's surrounded by other symbols of death. He has an hourglass in his hand, and if you look carefully, all the sand has run out into the bottom. Time has definitely run out for Robert Nicholson. He also has a spade in his hand for digging the grave. You can see a bell, again a symbol of death used to toll the death knell. And above it, a scroll carried by 2 little cherubs that says, Memento Mori, remember death. All of these symbols can be seen right the way throughout the cathedral, leaning against the walls in the shape of the most fantastic carved gravestones. In the early centuries of St Magnus Cathedral, those who were in positions of great power and privilege were allowed on death to be buried within the walls of the cathedral. They really were the greatest of the greatest and the good, the bishops, the earls, the landowners. But as time went on, Orkney, as with most of Britain, saw the rise of the moneyed classes, the merchants, those who became burgesses and councillors. And they, in their turn, when they died, bought their privilege to be buried under the floor of St Magnus Cathedral. And it was during those years, the 1600s, that the great fashion arose for ledger stones. Ledger stones are usually big carved stones that lie flat on the floor of a church or a cathedral. And so the whole of the nave of St Magnus Cathedral was filled with big, beautiful carved stones. But as time went on and the use of the building changed over time according to beliefs and fashions, eventually the time came for those stones to be lifted off the floor and placed against the walls. The remains themselves were exhumed from under the floor and reburied in the cathedral graveyard outside. But we have over 50 examples of carved ledger stones lining the walls of the cathedral today. And just like with the mortbrod, they have these wonderful symbols of death and mortality. You very often see the expression memento mori, and this is really the key to these symbols. As with the mortbrod, we can see things like the hourglass with the sands of time run out. We also see things like a candle with the allotted lifespan burning away, and once the candle is snuffed out, so is life. We also see the gravedigger's tools, the turf cutter, the spade, and of course we see things like a coffin, symbolic of death, and in the centre of all, the magnificent skull and crossed thigh bones. These are the largest bones in the human body and are the ones most likely to survive the passing of time. They are also the bones in the human body most recognisably human. So in a way, they're a symbol of humanity as much as they are a symbol of mortality. But what did they mean to the people at the time? When people had these carved on their gravestones, what meaning did people take from them? All of these things were to remind us that time is short. Our lifespan on this earth is of a limited duration. And in a way, it's a reminder to make the most of it, to live a full life. But it's also a reminder of something yet to come, because most of these people would have had a deep belief that there was a life after this one. There was either a heaven or there was a hell. And if you were a good person and lived a good life, then of course your reward would be in heaven. And these symbols remind us that we're all going there. Nobody escapes. Not the great or the small or the rich or the poor. None of us escape death. All of us are going to go there. And so to see these symbols would have been a reminder to everybody to think on, to remember that there's a life after this one, and to be a good Christian. St. Magnus Cathedral has a history stretching back nearly 900 years. Many, many bishops and priests and ministers have stood in pulpits like this one to address God or to address a congregation. In the late 18th century, the minister was a man called the Reverend Robert Ewell, and he is one of those characters who has made the transition from history into folklore with this story. He tells the tale that he was standing here one Sunday morning giving a typical sermon. There was a bit of fire and brimstone. There was exhorting people to recognize their sins and pray for forgiveness. And he had a full kirk, as he always did. But right in the front row, there was a young girl, and she was listening intently. She was hanging on every word. But every now and again, she smiled. And the Reverend Robert Ewell saw every now and again this little smile playing on her lips. And it annoyed him. He couldn't understand why this was a cause for levity and jollity. This was a serious subject. But again, every now and again, she would smile, and sometimes she would give a little titter, a little giggle. And as the sermon went on, her smile became broader and broader, until eventually she let out a great guffaw of laughter. And the Reverend Robert Ewell was not impressed by this. And at the end of the sermon, He asked her to stay behind and speak to him on serious matters. Well, she came to speak to him afterwards, and she explained what had given her so much amusement. And she told him this, that all the way through the sermon, there was a little devil sitting up in the rafters of the cathedral. And what was he doing? He was scanning the congregation, and he was noting everybody who'd fallen asleep during the sermon. Not only that, he was writing them down. He had a piece of paper and a pen, and he was jotting down the names of all the people who were asleep. But there were so many people having a snooze that he ran out of paper. He'd covered one side of the sheet of paper, he'd covered the other, and he needed more writing material. So he'd reached down and he'd pulled out the tail of his white shirt, and he'd started writing the names on that. And he wrote more and more names, and he needed more and more space, so he tugged, and he gave one huge, enormous tug on his shirt, and it knocked him flying backwards, and he banged his head on the rafters and tumbled right the way down into the choir. And that, she said, is when I laughed. This cathedral is believed to be the only one in the British Isles that has a dungeon. Behind me is the infamous Marwick's Hole, and it's believed that in centuries gone by, people who were convicted of crimes against God would be plunged down into the depths of this dungeon. It was believed that it was a bottle dungeon, and it was constructed in such a way that it was impossible to lie or sit or stand in comfort for any length of time. A true torture chamber. People would only be held in here for a few days, because then they would be taken out and their punishment conducted, whatever that might be. Being in Marwick's Hole itself was not the punishment, unpleasant though it might have been. In the early 17th century, Orkney, as much of Scotland, was caught up in the belief that there were witches abroad in the country and that they must be crushed at every opportunity. This crusade was led by the king himself, King James VI, who believed that there were women and sometimes men in Scotland who were in league with the devil. People sought them out. They convicted them, they tried them, they found them guilty, and many of them were executed. Orkney was no exception. According to some of the records that we have, some of those people accused of witchcraft were held here in the dungeon of Marwick's Hole. One of those people was a young woman called Janet Forsythe. She was born in the island of Westray, and she grew up into a lively, well-liked young woman. She had a fiancé, a boyfriend called Ben Gurrick, who was a fisherman. Ben and his friends had planned on a fishing trip. But the night before, Janet had had a dream. And in the dream, Ben and his friends were lost, that they didn't make it home again. And she was so struck by this dream that the next morning she exhorted him. She said, "Ben, please don't go, I fear for you." It was a beautiful day. He and his friends couldn't understand why she was so upset. And as planned, off they set to fish for the day. But as dusk fell, they did not return. And when the morning came, there was still no sign of them. As the days passed, it was clear that Ben and his friends had been lost at sea. Well, it was believed by some that Janet herself had been responsible for this, that somehow she had conjured up bad weather, that fog had descended, that an ill wind had blown that had sunk the boat. She, of course, denied it. But as time went on, people said that she was in league with the elements, that she could control the weather. And they called her the Storm Witch. Janet became very insular. She became very inward looking. She kept herself to herself. She became very bad-tempered. She would mutter curses under her breath. And so, of course, the stories grew. There was one particular summer's evening when a bad storm came in off the sea. And a ship, a merchant ship that was trying to come into port, was obviously struggling in the heavy waves. Janet ran down to the shore and tried to rally people to help with the boat. Nobody wanted to risk it. To head out into a small boat into the open sea would have been to risk their own lives, and nobody wanted to do it. So Janet herself pulled her own little wooden boat out into the stormy seas and managed with great skill to navigate her way to the merchant ship. She climbed up the rope and they could see her on board the ship as she skillfully and carefully managed to guide the ship safely into Pirawall Bay. All of the crew were rescued, as was the cargo. And you would think that people would have feted her, that she would have been celebrated for this great act of bravery. But no. That act of bravery sealed her fate, because people were more convinced than ever that Janet was a witch. She was taken as a prisoner and she was brought here to St Magnus Cathedral. She was held in this infamous prison of Marwick's Hole. The trial itself was held in the cathedral. It was simply the biggest building in the islands, and many people wanted to watch the trial. After 3 days of evidence, of people claiming that she had stolen the milk from their cow, or she had made people sick and she had caused the crops to fail, they found her guilty, and she was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead and then burnt as a witch. Just as the sentence was being passed, Janet, in her terror, scanned the people in the room, and right at the back, inside the door of the cathedral, she saw a familiar face, a well-loved face. It was Ben. It was Ben Gurrock, and there he was, standing in a navy uniform. He hadn't been lost at sea at all. He and his friends had been caught by the press gang, had been taken into the British Navy and forced to serve at sea. As she was dragged away to the dungeon, she cried out, "Ben, Ben, save me." Well, the next morning, when her jailers came to take her away for execution, they found the cell empty. Somehow, in the middle of the night, Ben Gurrock had managed to rescue his beloved and spirit her away from the islands. Now, it is said that in later years, an Orkney person travelling through the city of Manchester saw a sign above a shop. The sign said Ben Gurrock, Chandler. And he thought, that's a familiar name. In fact, it's an Orkney name. I'm going to go and see who's in that shop. And when he walked in, there behind the wooden counter was the Westry Storm Witch herself, Janet Forsythe. And it is said that Janet and Ben had a long, successful life, many children, and that their descendants are still living in the city of Manchester to this day. And that is one of the very few examples of a story of a witch trial and Marwick's Hole that has a happy ending. Here we are in the Triforium of St Magnus Cathedral, one of the upper levels. There's all sorts of corridors and passageways and nooks and crannies, and a few rather interesting artefacts. The most notorious, the most infamous object that we own is here, and this is the Hangman's Ladder. This great long wooden structure was used at the Gallows. And not far from here in Kirkwall, there's a street called the Clay Lone. It's now developed, built up, houses all around, but it once stood right on the outskirts of the city, and at the top of the hill stood the site of the Gallows. Now, every time somebody was to be hanged, they built the gallows. It didn't stand there alone, stark against the sky permanently. It was built every time it was used. And it was a big wooden structure with a tall beam and a cross beam and a supporting beam and a rope. And of course, the person who was to be hanged had to get up to that rope, which is where the ladder comes in. You can see on the ladder it has 2 sets of rungs. And the idea was that the hangman went up one side of the ladder and the person to be hanged went up the other side of the ladder. It used to be said that one set of rungs was thinner, more worn down than the other, for the very simple reason that the hangman came back down the ladder again. The other person did not. We don't know for sure how old this ladder is, but it's certainly several hundred years old. And as far as we know, the last person to climb the ladder and to be hanged was a young lady. Her name was Marjorie Mason, and she was born in the island of Shappensea. The year was 1728. Marjorie, a young unmarried lady, found herself pregnant with a child. As time went on and she gave birth, the child died. Now Marjorie herself claimed that the child was stillborn, that it was born dead. But the authorities and the church were of the opinion that she had smothered the child and therefore was guilty of child murder. She had nobody to speak up in her defence, and so Marjorie was sentenced to death. And she was taken along the route through the streets, amongst people she would have known, friends and family who would have recognised her, taken up to the Gallows, where she climbed the hangman's ladder, slipped her head into the noose and fell to her death. As far as we know, she was the last person to climb the hangman's ladder and also the last person to die in a hanging in Orkney. In the middle of the 19th century, Britain had an empire that stretched right across the world. The British merchants had ships that plied all of the oceans, and they were always trying to seek new trade routes. One of the most elusive of those trade routes was the one they called the Northwest Passage. And this was a navigable channel across the top of the Americas. It would join up the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and it would save the British cargo ships having to go south around Cape Horn. Many people had tried and failed to find the Northwest Passage, but in 1845 the Royal Navy made a concerted effort. They sent two ships under the command of John Franklin, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They set off 1845. Their last landfall was Stromness in Orkney, where they picked up fresh water, crew members and supplies, headed off across the Atlantic to the Arctic regions of northern Canada. The expedition failed. A run of terrible winters, problems with the food supply, and all manner of other difficulties meant that Franklin's ships became locked in the ice and all on board perished. As the years went by, several expeditions were sent to try and find out what had happened to the Franklin ships. And a few years after that, the Orcadian explorer and doctor John Ray was sent out to the Arctic to try and see if he could find out the fate of the Franklin expedition. He met many members of the native Canadian tribes, the Inuit, and they taught him how to survive in the cruel Arctic winters. And because of that, he managed to travel further than any other white man had gone before. He also, in his discussions with the Inuit, found out what had happened to Franklin's ships and Franklin's men, and it was a devastating story. It was said that several had struggled onto the ice, the survivors, the stragglers, and they had been starving, they had been malnourished, they had been diseased, and that their last days and weeks would have been utterly miserable and filled with pain. The Inuit also told tales of further horror. Evidence, they said, that Franklin's men, in a last desperate attempt to survive, had committed acts of cannibalism. They had eaten one another. Now, of course, when this story was brought back by John Ray to the British Admiralty, they simply didn't want to know. He was vilified, He was accused of having gone native, and they simply refused to believe his account. Of course, it was many years later, and it was discovered that he was right. John Ray is believed also discovered the last link in the Northwest Passage. And finally, in recent years, the credit that he deserved has finally come to him. But the reason I'm actually standing here is to show you this gravestone here. The local woman, her name was Catherine Wishart. She was married to a man called Thomas Work. And he was a seaman. He had been out at sea throughout his entire working life. And like many Orkney men, he was used to rough seas, terrible weather conditions, and so much in demand for his seafaring abilities, particularly by the British Navy. And he actually joined the Navy shortly before the Franklin expedition. He was an able seaman and he served on HMS Erebus alongside the captain, John Franklin. So he is one of the ones that crewed that ship, one of the ones who was lost on the ice, and who knows what horrors he might have seen. Of course, he never came home, and his wife, having accepted his death, would have received a small army pension. She died herself just a few years later at the age of 46, and she is buried here. Thomas Work, of course, is buried somewhere deep beneath the Arctic ice, and who knows what horrors he might have witnessed in his final days.